3 here. You're going to turn there in your Bibles. Promises. Promises, promises. Our lives are filled with promises made and also promises broken, right? That people are constantly promising us things they can't deliver. So, for example, in 3 minutes a day, you can lose 10 pounds with the Ab Circle Pro. And I've got that right there. You can check that out. 3 minutes a day. Or our miracle cream will make your wrinkles disappear. I mean, it's a wonder cream right there. I mean, it's a miracle cream. Brush your scalp with this laser and you can actually regrow your hair. It's just amazing. I mean, sometimes advertisers don't even try to sound plausible. I've got a series of advertisements from the Dorco Pace Razor. Let's see the first one there. And you can read their advertisements. Go to the next slide there. You'll be so sharp, you'll think that you're like James Bond. Right? What's the next one? I think 4 of these. You're going to find a hot vampire boyfriend. I mean, these are promises that they're making. What's the next one? We got, you'll get a closet full of shoes. You use the Dorco. And that's for the ladies' razor, by the way. You guys, it doesn't work for you. And then the last one, what's the last one there? This thing will last since 1955. You have to change your razor blade every so often, but not with the Dorco razor blade. So, these ideas of advertisers, they're making promises all the time. And we've seen firsthand, of course, even in our current political cycle, the kind of promises that they make. Right? So we're going to lower your taxes, we're going to raise your incomes, we're going to give you a better quality of life while still eliminating the debt. You can have it all. And your life will be so much better if you just vote for me. Right? During the 1928 campaign, Herbert Hoover had this famous promise: a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Wow, wouldn't that be wonderful? I don't know that he actually delivered on that one. Right? And of course, we're familiar with the promises that loved ones sometimes make. Right? Promises that involve words like forever and never again and always. And we learn early on that promises are made only to be broken. And that a life filled with broken promises makes me wonder sometimes if you can ever trust a promise these days. As you think through that, it seems like they're given out so easily. They're passed out like pennies with no thought of their value. Or perhaps with the realization that they cost nothing. And so, how many of us have suffered at the hands of broken promises? I think we've suffered enough to know that you can't really trust them very much. And that so many times we learn that you need to rather make contracts and deeds and have legal obligations. Get it on paper, make it ironclad. After all, what is a person's word really worth these days? Not much, it seems. And we want to put it in writing. We want to make it an obligation. We want to make it something they have to do. We can't trust simply in a promise. Because promises are simply spoken. And they float into the air like something on the breeze, quickly forgotten. Perhaps not by the one spoken to, but surely by the one who speaks them. Because they're very rarely followed through on. They say that promises are like babies. Easy to make and hard to deliver. So, I don't know, ladies, you can attest to that one. But promises are something that Paul still believes in. And we're going to see that he is going to talk about a key promise that we can still trust in our lives. Now, you might remember that we've been going through the letter of Galatians, and that this is a situation in which Paul is addressing a church in which some Jewish Christians have come in, and they've tried to teach the Gentiles that they need to be circumcised and follow the Jewish law. And so here in chapter 3, we're first looking at Paul's response where he talks directly to the Galatian Christians. And he's trying to convince them not to follow the position that is advocated by these Judaizers. He's trying to convince them that they don't need to be circumcised. And this text is kind of full of rabbinic-style arguments, and it's difficult to follow at times, so we're not going to dig into each phrase and so forth. We're going to look more big picture here and highlight some of the thoughts that he's making. But let's read the first section, verses 1 through 5. You foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. The only thing I want to learn from you is this. Did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish, having started with the Spirit, are you now ending with the flesh? Did you experience so much for nothing? If it really was for nothing. Well then, does God supply you with the Spirit and work miracles among you by your doing the works of the law, or by your believing what you heard? So in this section here, Paul begins with some pretty strong language. I mean, he's using some rhetorical moves to get their attention. Hey, dim-witted ones, has someone cast a spell on you that you can't see that clearly? Have your brains been turned off? You have the Spirit, right? You have experienced the power of God among you. Is that not correct? You've seen miracles in your lives. How did that happen, by the way? Did that come about because you were following the law? Because you were circumcised? And so if you already have the Spirit, what more are you seeking at this point? Your own experience reveals that you're already in a relationship with God. And so Paul begins by criticizing them because they've already experienced God and received the blessing of God. So how is it now that they're trying to do something to get the blessing of God? Because they already have it. Now, as we reflect on this kind of strange way of thinking, it seems, at least to me, somehow familiar. I mean, how many of us have started our journey of faith by accepting the grace of God, only to find ourselves kind of struggling to deserve it, right? To be worthy of His forgiveness. We try and find ways to make ourselves pleasing to God. So starting with the Spirit, we too sometimes end with the flesh. And for Paul, this kind of thinking is simply foolishness. You know, if you begin your Christian life by recognizing that you're totally dependent on God, that it is God who saves, that it is His power who rescues, that it is His love that forgives us, how do you then begin to believe that you could in any way merit that or earn that? Now, I don't want us to be misled. Of course, our situation is not exactly the same as the Galatian Christians. They're being told by the Judaizers that what they've done so far in believing in Jesus is a good first step. And they said, well, you know, you believed in Jesus and you know, that's a good, great beginning, but in order to be part of the people of God, you have to do what God asks. You have to be part of the children of Abraham. And children of Abraham are all circumcised. And so something more is needed. Now, our struggle, I think, is different. You know, there's something more that we pursue, but it's definitely not circumcision. And it's just as easy, however, for us to slip into this belief that salvation is dependent on my performance. After all, it seems that the biblical writers have these very long lists of do's and don'ts, and you can get the impression that my performance of those affects my salvation. And remember Jesus, by the way, saying that one line, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. I mean, you're destined to failure if you try to fill that one. And even Paul, of course, spells out a lot of shoulds and should nots, and he even has in the letter to Galatians a whole list of those, and we're going to get to those later on. So you can get this impression in your life that you have to do all of these things, and that we're judged and rewarded based on our performance. That it's all about how well I do that determines my faith. And I think that's conditioned by our culture and by the world around us. You know, I work in an academic setting where all of the time we are judging and evaluating students based on their performance. And so whether it be a test or some other kind of assignment, you give a grade for that. Your performance merits this. And I often tell my students, it's not about whether I like you or not, I'm just measuring what you've done. That's what it is. And so you don't turn in your homework, you get a 0. The more answers you know on a test, the higher your score will be. You get to determine your grade. And the same is true often in our work environments, right? That you are judged by how well you complete your assigned task, that how well you serve your customers, how much money you make for the business, how many sales you close, how many widgets you create. That's the way our world works. And if you do well, if you excel, then you have the right to be rewarded. You've earned it. You're not dependent on someone else just handing you out something, but you have to do certain things to be compensated for. Whether that's a grade or whether it's money, we're judged by our performance. And so I think we take that mindset and that understanding of our culture and we bring it into our religious faith and we pervert the New Testament into some kind of legal system. And we make it into a no less binding law than we find in the Old Testament. And we hope that through careful observance, we can ensure our place in heaven. Now, thinking of it this way, we kind of assume if I just get all my ducks in a row, if I just am obedient enough, God will be forced to let me in. So we come to church and read our Bibles and we say our prayers and we put money in the plate and we buy a homeless man a hamburger and we think, I'm doing really well. Trying to prove ourselves to God. Trying to make ourselves worthy. But always feeling in the back of our minds that we're never quite there. And it's kind of that nagging thought that I want to address. So Paul seems to say that's not how God works. Let's read on in chapter 3, verse 6 and follow. Just as Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see those who believe are descendants of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared that the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe are blessed with Abraham who believe. So Paul points back to the example of Abraham, which is, of course, a wise move, since it's most likely that the Judaizers are also pointing to Abraham as part of their proof and their argument. After all, it was to Abraham that God first gave instructions about circumcision. And it was supposed to be an everlasting covenant given to Abraham, and you can read about that in chapter 17. And so Paul is pointing to a chapter, 2 chapters earlier, chapter 15. He's going before that circumcision covenant. God had already made a promise to Abraham back in these chapters, making him a great nation. And it had been a few years, remember, he'd been childless when God comes to him, and he makes this kind of covenant. Abraham was getting a little anxious, and so here's what God says in chapter 15. He brought him outside, and he said, look toward heaven, count the stars if you are able to count them, so shall your descendants be. And he believed God, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. For Paul, this text right here becomes the centerpiece of his argument. It's a foundational text with kind of something profound about it as we look at this text. It's especially important for Paul because it predates circumcision. It's a text that comes, as I said, 2 chapters before he ever gave the instructions about circumcision. And it says that God declared Abraham righteous before he was ever circumcised. But the question is why? Why is Abraham righteous? What did Abraham do to receive this righteousness? What great work did he accomplish? What act of obedience did he perform? What kind of list of credentials could he bring? What deed of merit? When we look at this, it says he believed. He trusted in the one who promised. He put his faith in the one who was speaking the words. And it was this simple act of faith, according to the text, that enabled him to be righteous. And the Judaizers, they say, well, you have to be children of Abraham to be part of the people of God. And Paul agrees. You have to be a child of Abraham. But to be a child of Abraham does not require physical descent. It doesn't require you to go through some ritual ceremony in which you're circumcised. It only requires you to be a person of faith, like Abraham. It requires you to trust in the one who promises. And according to Paul, this is what God was referring to when he says that all the nations, here read, of course, Gentiles, will be blessed through you. All who follow the path of Abraham, all who believe like Abraham, will be blessed. Now the rest of this section kind of contrasts the path of law and faith. Let's read on. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who does not observe and obey all the things written in the book of the law." Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law. For the one who is righteous will live by faith. But the law does not rest on faith. On the contrary, whoever does the works of the law will live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree," in order that in Christ Jesus the blessings of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So what Paul is talking about in this section is just recognizing that the people who are under a law system, specifically the Old Testament law, are under a curse. And you are judged purely and solely by your performance. If you live by the law, you have to do it. You have to perform it. And failure to obey results in a curse. And so he points to Deuteronomy 28 as an illustration of that. It's not a matter of trying your best. It's not a matter of wanting and wishing to do well. It's purely a matter of fulfillment at that point. But Jesus, he says, has redeemed us from the curse of the law, has rescued us, both Jews and Gentiles, from that fate, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit. Paul is trumping the argument of the Judaizers by redefining what it means to be a child of Abraham. And so what we see here is that God began something in Abraham that goes beyond the Jewish people and the Jewish law. So I kind of want to go back to Genesis for just a minute and kind of repaint this picture, because I want us to see what Paul sees in the call of Abraham. It's something pretty profound, to recognize the implications of this story. So let's go back and look at the early section of Genesis. Unfortunately, of course, this story has kind of been hijacked by the creation-evolution debate, and all the time people come to this, they're now thinking about how the world was made and all that kind of stuff. And I don't want us to really even focus on that. And I want you to be able to hear this story regardless of whether you take a kind of a literal approach or metaphorical approach. It doesn't matter. I want us to hear the story. What's the story in Genesis? The storyline is this. God creates this great world, this good world. It's right and it's whole. And in this creation, he creates a place of harmony. A place where all people get along. And he creates, as the pinnacle of his creation, humans, made in his own image. And he places them in this garden. It's a place of intimate communion. And this is symbolized by that note where God walks among them, right? God is there in the garden. And all the creatures and all the animals and all the humans are there together in community, in harmony. It's a place of relationship. A place of intimate fellowship between creature and creator. A vision of what life was meant to be. Of what life was always supposed to be. Yet all of this comes crashing down, not because of what he did, but because of what we did. Right? And the story makes it clear that the distance that we now feel and experience from our Creator is because of our own choices. It's the choices of humans to go their own way, to follow their own will, and disregard the direction that he has set that has caused this distance. And in the early chapters, we see the inevitable consequences of following this path as the story progresses, right? So remember, the very first story, once they're kicked out of the garden, is a story of fratricide, where Cain kills his brother Abel. And things spiral downward so quickly that by chapter 6, God is ready to wipe the earth clean once again. And the world is washed with the flood. But even so, it cannot wash away the tendency within us, within humans, in our hearts, toward evilness, evil and selfishness and sin, that we continue on that path. It's almost as if the message of the flood is that as long as humans are involved, things will continue to go wrong. And so when we come to the end of this kind of primeval history in chapter 12, we find God calling one man. Look at chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Now when we think about that, we have to ask, what did he do to deserve such a call? Now, the rabbis tried to write stories about Abraham, trying to show that he was worthy, that he stood out among all his fellow men as different, as a non-idol worshiper. But the biblical text says absolutely nothing about that. In the text, he was a man chosen by God, not for his own sake, but for our sake. Not for the sake of the Jews only, but for the sake of all of humanity. And that choosing was the beginning of the end. The end of our isolation from our Creator, from the Father who loves us. It was the plan of God which culminates in Jesus Christ. But although it begins with Abraham, here's the key, it doesn't depend on him. Right? He is not called to achieve some great task. He's not chosen to perform some mighty labors like Hercules. He is not selected because of his superior credentials. He is simply a man chosen by God. A man who struggles, as we've seen earlier, throughout his own life with doubts and imperfections. But none of that matters for the plan to work. Right? Because the plan doesn't depend on Abraham. He could have chosen anybody. The plan depends on God alone, the one who makes the promise. All Abraham is called to do is to trust in the one who promises. And I think that brings us kind of to the heart of the matter here, that too often as Christians, we become fixated on ourselves, our own inadequacies and our imperfections, our own inability to live a holy life. And whenever we try, the harder we try, and the more we fail, we feel guilty for that. I mean, sometimes I think we do pretend that we're better than we are, and sometimes we even fool ourselves into thinking that we're better than we are, but then it all comes crashing down. It doesn't last very long. I mean, when we're honest with ourselves, we see all of our weaknesses that no one else sees. And if you're living under law, then you truly know it's cursed because you feel that guilt. It's a ponderous chain that just weighs you down and sucks the life out of you. And the doubts and fears can be hard to keep at bay. And I've heard story after story of, older people on their deathbed saying, "I hope I've done enough." And that sense of hopelessness is something God never intended for us. See, the Christian faith is, at that point, is not a joy. It's a burden when the guilt is there. It's something that we undertake out of fear. It's something that we do because there's this wrathful God. There's this stern disciplinarian holding it over our heads. He's a frightening specter to be respected, revered, but never loved. How could this ever be called good news? But Paul cries out, "Oh, foolish ones, that's not the God that we follow." God is a loving Father who rescues and saves. And He promises us the world. The world as it was always meant to be. The world as He created it to be. As He intended it to be. So I invite the praise team to come up as I leave you with this final image. It's on the next slide. It's perhaps a familiar one, especially for those of you who have young children. The father stands in the pool and his child is on the ledge, right? And the child, of course, is very, very hesitant about the whole business because they don't know how to swim. And the father says, "Jump. I'll catch you. I promise." And the question really is not, do you believe the promise or not? The question is, do you believe in the one who promises? Do you trust the Father?
This next song you won't know because it's very new, but it's just to reflect on the message.